Right now, somewhere in Egypt, there are people who died before the Roman Empire existed. And some of them still have hair. Not skeletons, not fossils, actual skin, actual teeth, actual fingerprints. Researchers have even detected traces of the scents used to prepare them thousands of years ago, which is deeply strange when you stop to think about it. Because the people who created those mummies had no refrigerators, no laboratories, no microscopes. They had never heard the word bacteria. They didn't know microbes existed. And yet their work is still here, still intact, still preserving people who walked the earth more than 3,000 years ago. So how did they do it? How did people armed with bronze tools and religious beliefs accidentally stumble onto one of the most effective preservation techniques in human history? And why were they trying so desperately to preserve the dead in the first place? That second question matters more than most people realize. Because the Egyptians weren't doing this for science. They weren't doing it out of curiosity. They were doing it out of fear. A very specific, very urgent fear that shaped everything about how they lived and how they died. To understand mummification, you first have to understand what ancient Egyptians believed happened after death. To them, death wasn't an ending. It was a transition. The soul continued existing after the body stopped. It moved into another world, faced judgment, and if it passed, entered a paradise that would last forever. But there was a condition, a deeply uncomfortable condition. For the soul to survive in the afterlife, the body it came from had to survive here. If the body decayed and disappeared, the soul's journey could be endangered. Preserving a dead person wasn't a ritual. It wasn't tradition. It was a practical necessity, a form of protection. You were not burying someone. You were preparing them for the next stage of journey that never actually ended. That belief drove everything that followed. But turning belief into reality created an immediate problem. Because the moment someone dies, nature begins destroying them. Bacteria already living inside the body start breaking down tissue within hours. Moisture accelerates everything. Insects arrive. Within days, decomposition takes hold so completely that nothing recognizable remains within weeks. Ancient Egyptians had no way to stop that process scientifically, but they were extraordinary observers. And over generations, they noticed something strange happening in the desert around them. Bodies buried naturally in dry sand sometimes emerged remarkably preserved. The heat pulled moisture from the tissue. Without moisture, the bacteria that caused decay had nothing to work with. The desert was doing something that shouldn't have been possible, and the Egyptians paid attention. What if that process could be controlled? What if they could recreate what the desert did naturally, but do it deliberately, precisely, on their own terms? That question launched one of the longest and most refined experiments in ancient history. The process they eventually developed took approximately 70 days. 70 days of careful, deliberate work on a single body. And it began with something that sounds almost violent: removing the organs. The lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines were carefully extracted and preserved separately inside elegant stone containers called canopic jars, each protected by a different deity. The reasoning was sound, even by modern standards. Most of the body's internal moisture was concentrated in those organs. Remove them, and you removed the primary source of decay. But here's where it gets strange. One organ was always left behind: the heart. Because Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence, memory, and personality. The heart was who you were. It would be weighed against a feather in the afterlife to determine your fate. Removing it was unthinkable, which means they preserved the wrong organ. We now know the brain controls everything they attributed to the heart. But ancient Egyptians had a very different opinion of the brain. They removed it through the nose using long, hooked instruments. And then they threw it away. The organ that generates every thought, every memory, every emotion a person ever experiences was considered so unimportant that embalmers discarded it without ceremony. That detail alone should make you pause. After the organs were removed, the body still contained enormous amounts of moisture locked inside the tissue itself. And that required the most important ingredient in the entire process: natron. Natron is a naturally occurring salt mixture found around dry Egyptian lake beds. It looks unremarkable, but its ability to draw water out of organic material is extraordinary. The body would be packed completely in natron and left for around 40 days while the salt slowly pulled almost all remaining moisture from the tissue. No electricity, no chemical engineering, just salt and time. And it worked. Modern researchers have replicated this process and confirmed that natron is remarkably effective at halting decomposition. The Egyptians hadn't invented chemistry, but they had discovered one of its most powerful principles through nothing but careful observation across centuries. But here is something that almost never gets mentioned. Mummies didn't smell like death. Recent chemical analysis of mummification substances revealed something unexpected. The materials used included pine resin, juniper oil, frankincense, myrrh, and plant-based compounds sourced from regions thousands of kilometers away from Egypt. These weren't purely symbolic choices. Many of those substances have genuine antibacterial properties. Without any knowledge of microbiology, without any understanding of what bacteria even were, Egyptian embalmers had identified materials that actively inhibited the biological processes causing decay. They didn't know why those substances worked, but they knew that bodies prepared with them lasted longer than bodies that weren't. That knowledge was built across generations of trial and observation. No universities, no written chemistry, just accumulated experience passed carefully from one embalmer to the next across hundreds of years. After drying, the body was wrapped in linen. Not a single layer, sometimes dozens of layers, with protective amulets placed between each one. Specific prayers were spoken at specific moments. Priests performed rituals designed to reactivate the senses of the deceased. The wrapping itself could take weeks. And then came the burial. Food, jewelry, furniture, tools, and weapons were placed in the tomb alongside the body. Small figurines called ushabtis were included to serve the deceased in the afterlife, performing any labor the gods might demand. Everything a person needed in life was provided for what came after. Because in the Egyptian worldview, death didn't change what you needed. It only changed where you were. Think about what this created. An entire industry built around the dead. Specialized embalmers, linen producers, craftsmen carving canopic jars, artists painting tomb walls, priests performing rituals, merchants importing resins and oils from distant civilizations. All of it sustained by a single belief, that the dead were still somewhere, still present, still in need of care. And the trade networks this belief created were extraordinary. Chemical analysis of mummification materials has revealed ingredients from the Mediterranean, sub-Saharan Africa, and even Southeast Asia. These weren't isolated people. They were connected to a world far larger than most history suggests, and their demand for preservation materials was one of the engines driving that connection. But here's the question that stays with you after all of this. Why does mummification still fascinate us today? It isn't simply because mummies are ancient, or because they're strange, or because seeing preserved human faces from thousands of years ago feels unsettling in a way that's hard to explain. It's because buried underneath all the linen and ritual and salt is something completely recognizable. The Egyptians looked at death and refused to accept that the people they loved could simply vanish. They built an entire science, an entire theology, an entire economy around that refusal. They imported materials from across the known world. They trained specialists. They spent 70 days on a single body, all because disappearing felt unbearable. We still feel that. We keep photographs. We build memorials. We tell stories about the people we've lost. We visit graves decades after someone is gone. The tools are different. The belief systems are different. But the feeling underneath all of it is exactly the same. Thousands of years ago, Egyptians asked a question that humanity never stops asking. How do you keep something from disappearing forever? Their answer was imperfect, strange, built on beliefs we no longer share. But here we are, thousands of years later, still talking about them by name. And in the way that mattered most to them, that means it worked.